presentation. For those who are new faces to our Thursday history program series, welcome. We have a great crowd tonight. My name is Sebry Charpentier, and I'm the history program director here at King's Chapel. And I'm really excited for you to all be here and to have Peter Walker with us. In terms of some logistics before we get started, as I said, we are recording tonight's presentation and conversation. And we do ask that you keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. And please make use of the chat function with any questions you may have during the presentation. And then afterwards, when we have time for question and answer, continue to put your questions in the chat and we'll moderate it and be able to share your questions with Peter. So I hope you'll all join me in welcoming Peter Walker for our presentation tonight. Peter has his PhD or his BA and Master's in Philosophy from the University of Oxford and a PhD from Columbia University. He's now an assistant professor of history at the University of Wyoming, where he studies religion in the 18th century British Empire and is working on a book titled The Church Militant, Loyalism, the Church of England, and the American Revolution. So without further ado, welcome Peter, and we can go ahead and get started.
Okay, thank you, Faye, and thank you all for tuning in. It's great to be able to talk to you from Wyoming, and actually I do want to say one of the nice things about having online events like this is being able to attend events all across the country, and especially if you live somewhere like Wyoming, that really is quite a nice thing. So I realize there's a lot that gets lost not being able to do this in person, but I do think there are some kind of upsides to these webinars that we should be aware of. Okay, so I'll get started. I'm going to try to talk for about 35 minutes. We'll see if I manage that. And then hopefully to leave some time for questions at the end. If you have a question and you don't have time, I've got my email up here. And I'd be very happy to answer a question over email after the talk finishes as well. As Faye says, I'm working on a book about loyalism, the Church of England and the American Revolution. What I want to do for you tonight is to start off just with a few minutes kind of describing why I find this subject interesting as a historian, what kind of draws me to this subject as a historian. And then hopefully getting that out of the way fairly quickly, I want to tell you about an actual sort of real human being, the Reverend William Clark of Dedham, Massachusetts. And hopefully to sort of illustrate some of the bigger points by looking into the actual individual, which I hope will be a little bit more interesting for you. Okay, so general kind of big picture stuff first. In the book, I look at Anglicanism in colonial New England and the Mid-Atlantic. So kind of New England, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, the sort of region shown in this map here from 1730. From the point of view of the Church of England, this is a kind of distinct, interesting region in a couple of ways. So firstly, Anglicans in this part of America tend to become loyalists during the Revolution. I'm obviously generalizing a little bit here. It's particularly true of the clergy. It's true to a lesser extent of the laity. It's a different colony, different story, kind of colony by colony. And obviously religion is only ever kind of one factor influencing an individual's decision to become a loyalist or a patriot. But in general, Anglicans in this part of America become loyalists during the Revolution. In the South, they tend to become patriots. It's worth saying a little bit about loyalism as well. I imagine some people listening will have been taught about the American Revolution in a high school class or from the Freedom Trail, or perhaps even a college class from a few years ago, and not heard much about the Loyalists. Historians at the moment are very interested in the Loyalism, but I suspect some of you will have a very kind of sort of consensus picture of the American Revolution, where Americans kind of get together fairly unanimously and throw off British rule kind of altogether. There were, in fact, an awful lot of Americans who wanted to remain part of the British Empire, who perhaps disagreed with what King and Parliament were doing, but who nevertheless sort of thought of themselves as British Americans and who wanted to sort of keep things that way. And so historians, if you read kind of current historians on the American Revolution, they're quite likely to describe it as a civil war, and not just as a war of independence. So a war between Americans and other Americans, and not just a war between the Americans and the British. And so this is also sort of interesting. Then if the American Revolution is a civil war, then I think it's interesting to think of it being a civil war with these religious dimensions in certain parts of America. So that's the first thing. I've also, this is just in a cartoon showing the sort of loyalist clergy kind of rising up in arms against the colonists in support of the government. The other thing that's interesting about this part of America, from a kind of religious history point of view, Anglicans here are a religious minority. This is kind of a strange thing to be if you're an 18th century Anglican. The Church of England in England is the established church. It's a state church. The government kind of supports the church financially and sort of politically, ideologically. The monarch is the head of the Church of England, or the head on earth of the Church of England. And in exchange, the clergy, the church kind of pray for the government, pray for the king. The church is not a sort of a branch of the government or an arm of the government. The metaphor that gets used at the time is of a marriage. It's the church and state are kind of married. They're kind of two individual parties that are entering into a kind of contract with mutual obligations and responsibilities. So that's the Church of England in England. In here, this part of America, Anglicans are a minority. They're a demographic minority in the sense that there's not very many of them. And they're a kind of political minority in the sense that they're not supported by the kind of colony's government in the way that they're used to, and sometimes kind of in the way that they feel entitled to. So for example, instead of being paid by the government, they're generally paid as missionaries, missionaries from England by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, which I always get a kick out of saying, and here's their seal here. So one of the other things I'm interested in is the way that Anglicans in America kind of come to terms with this experience, and Anglicanism in this part of America evolves into something that's a little bit different from Anglicanism in the Old World. And there are times when these Anglicans kind of complain mightily about being oppressed and being kind of abandoned by the government at home. There are other times when they actually kind of embrace it a little bit, and there's a kind of spiritual authenticity that comes from being a religious minority. They can say, we chose the Church of England not for the rewards of being the established church, but kind of in spite of the challenges of being a religious minority and being sort of persecuted and all the sort of hardships that supposedly come with that. So those are the sort of two interesting things. And then the really interesting question for me is why is it that these two things go together? If you think about a loyalist, you might assume it's someone who likes the status quo and wants to keep things as they are, and therefore kind of opposes the revolution. In fact, with these Anglicans in New England and the mid-Atlantic, they spend the whole colonial period just complaining about the British government and complaining they're not being taken seriously and they're not being kind of recognized and rewarded in the way that they want. And yet when the revolution comes around, they're the sort of biggest loyalists out there. So why is that? That's just a kind of elevator pitch for the larger book project. What I now want to do is start talking about, as I say, an actual human being to give you something a little bit more kind of individual to get stuck into. This is the Reverend William Clark, who was an Anglican clergyman in Dedham, which is just kind of the southern edge of Boston, of today's Boston. And I've chosen him to talk about for two reasons. Firstly, he's kind of a slightly tragic character, and I find that quite intriguing. He has experiences more than his fair share of hardship, and I think that's maybe not what you might expect when you're hearing about a loyalist. Is a sort of tragic story, but his is quite a tragic story, and I find that quite intriguing. The other interesting thing about William Clark is he kept a journal. for pretty much for his entire life. I've given you the sort of the first entry here on the slide when he's 18. He writes in it pretty much every day for 56 years. So there's about 5,000 pages of this journal, and so something like 60 volumes. It's now at the New England Historic Genealogical Society, and I worked with this a couple of years ago on a New England Regional Fellowship Consortium fellowship. Some of you might have heard of this, but I want to kind of plug the fellowship, and also just to shout out to the Genealogical Society. They obviously do a lot of genealogical stuff, but if you're interested in New England history in general, there's a lot of great resources there that are worth checking out. So I spent 2 years ago, I spent 3 weeks kind of reading 5,000 words of this guy's diary, which was quite an experience. He tends to tell you an awful lot about what you don't want to know, and a lot of and then not very much at all about what you do want to know. But there are some sort of interesting things in there. And so for that reason as well, I wanted to kind of pick him out as an individual to focus on. So he was born in Danvers, Massachusetts in 1740. Another interesting thing to mention, he was deaf. So here from the 1759 journal, there's actually a list of cures for deafness which he's received, which haven't worked, and there's some sort of quite strange things on there. And so as well as being this kind of great source for an Anglican clergyman, I think this is also quite an interesting source for a person with a disability in early America, although that wasn't really how I was using it. But this kind of comes up with his life story as well as his deafness. He's the son of a Congregationalist minister. He becomes a Congregationalist himself, but then in 1767 he converts to the Church of England. He sails to England to receive ordination from a bishop, which you can't do in America because there are no bishops in America. Here's his ordination certificate. So he essentially has to make this 3,000-mile trip to have a bishop touch him and give him this piece of paper, and then he sails back. He almost dies of smallpox as well, which tends to happen to Americans who visit Europe. And the fact that he's a convert is interesting as well, because this is a common thing. In the 18th century, you have a kind of flow of converts from Congregationalism into the Church of England. So just for example, at the time of the American Revolution, there were 10 SPG missionaries in Massachusetts, and 8 of them used to be Congregationalists. And I'm really interested in the fact that they're converts. I think converts are really interesting people. I'm not going to talk about that too much now, because I want to kind of get onto the revolution. But if anyone is interested, I could talk more about that later. So he's ordained in England. He sails back to Massachusetts, settles as a missionary in Dedham, and he immediately finds that being part of a religious minority is a whole lot harder than being part of the established church. So, for example, his salary depends on the willingness of his people to give him money, and they don't want to. They say they're too poor. In theory, he's entitled to a share of the church rates levied by the colonial government, but in practice, he doesn't really get it. He also has to travel around kind of ministering to little groups of Anglicans in different places. He sort of itinerates a lot. And he complains that the church building is in poor repair and the minister's house is in poor repair. And he doesn't like any of this. And so within a year, actually, no, so it's not within a year, so within a couple of years, he's writing to the SPG asking to be sent somewhere nicer. So I could therefore much better enjoy myself in another part of America where episcopacy, meaning the Church of England, is the establishment, or at least does not labor under such oppressions. So he continues at Dedham. As you know, this is kind of as the dispute between Britain and the colonies is starting to heat up. And as that happens, kind of Clarke comes down on the Loyalist side. And I want to ask the question at this point, what is a Loyalist? What does it mean to be a Loyalist? So one definition would be someone who actively supports the British government, perhaps by fighting for them, or by writing loyalist material, like loyalist pamphlets, for example, or perhaps someone who signs a loyalist petition or a loyalist address, or someone who does something to be a loyalist. Clarke doesn't really do any of that. And in fact, he kind of insists that he's not an active partisan for the government. He insists that he's a kind of passive, neutral character who kind of withholds support from the Patriots, but isn't like actively supporting the British government either. And so he kind of presents himself actually as a passive victim of the Patriots. And so he articulates this, for example, a few years later, he's writing here in 1803, and he says that after first coming to Dedham as a missionary, in that beloved retirement I lived, as it were, unobserved by the world, till the frenzy of the times at the beginning of the revolution disturbed my repose. Never man lived more peacefully and quiet, never man meddled less with politics, or was a better friend to civil and religious liberty. So one of the kind of questions I want to pose for you is whether this is a fair description of what he does. And I'm going to kind of remain agnostic on this. I'm going to kind of describe to you what he does and what he says, and I'll let you make your own minds up whether he's a victim of the revolution or whether he's kind of playing the victim in order to really be a loyalist. Okay, so what do we know about what he says and does? Well, we have his letters to the SPG, where he sort of complains about how the Church of England is sort of seen as a kind of lackey of the government, and meets kind of a degree of popular hostility from the kind of local people. So just as an example of this, and there are sort of many examples of him saying this, our church in this country is but in a melancholy situation, and the more so on account of the civil discords of the present time. The people of this town are especially of such remarkable republican principles, and in consequence whereof, those of my mission are much oppressed, calumniated, and abused in every possible way. So he sort of says that his congregation are being oppressed by the local people for their association with the British government and the British the monarchy as well. We also have his sermons. He writes at one point, he says, I didn't touch politics in my sermons. I just said nothing about politics. And we can actually kind of test that because we have his sermons, which are at the Dedham Historical Society. So I've got one of these for you here, which he delivers in June 76, and then again in August 1776. And so this particular sermon, he kind of stands up and he starts, under the present distressing and impoverishing judgments of God upon the land, we are apt to be afflicted with fears of want and solicitous thoughts, how we and ours should be provided for in time to come. And in such circumstances, it may be of great use to us to be directed to the proper remedy of such disquieting cares in this time of trial. So he's sort of saying here that the political dispute, the political unrest is a judgment of God, a punishment of God. And he's telling his hearers in the sermon that what they're supposed to do is just to kind of passively, quietly suffer through this. So it's not exactly commenting on the political disputes. He's not quite coming out and saying, well, I think that Parliament has the right to levy this tax, and here's why. But it's also clear that he's not so neutral here either. I think it's clear where his sympathies lie. So that's his sermons. What he's still at this point kind of withholding support from the revolution, and he's able to continue doing so until the Declaration of Independence, and that's when he kind of really starts to have to make a decision to kind of publicly to endorse or not to endorse independence, and the reason for that has to do with the Anglican church service. So the Anglican church service, you may know, is set according to the Book of Common Prayer. There are kind of set forms for prayer from this book called the Book of Common Prayer, which in the 18th century includes prayers for the king. And so I've just got one of them here. There are a couple of them throughout the Book of Common Prayer, but Clark, as a clergyman, is supposed to kind of stand up in church and read this prayer every Sunday. So most heartily we beseech thee. Oh, sorry, I moved with my thing. There we are. Most heartily we beseech thee, with thy favour, to behold our most gracious sovereign, Lord King George, and so replenish him with the grace of thy Holy Spirit, that he may always incline to thy will and walk in thy way. Endue him plenteously with heavenly gifts. Grant him health and wealth long to live. Strengthen him so that he may vanquish and overcome all his enemies. And finally, after this life, that he may attain everlasting joy and felicity through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So you're not allowed to say that after the Declaration of Independence. The independent states passed laws outlawing kind of treasonous speech, and they consider this treasonous speech. So what do you do? What do Anglicans do in this situation? It's interesting because it's partly a kind of political question, it's partly a theological question, it's a little bit of both. So there are Patriot Anglicans who take the position that the Book of Common Prayer tells them to pray for their governors, their secular governors, whoever that happens to be. So it used to be George III, now it's Congress. Just say the prayer and switch out George III for Congress, and you're still good. Another position is to kind of hedge your bets and just to leave out these prayers. So it's just kind of don't say anything and just kind of skip out when you get to this bit. So that's a kind of like a more of a neutral or sort of passive position. The loyalist position is that it is a sin to deviate from the letter of the Book of Common Prayer unless you've sort of explicitly been told that you're allowed to do so, and that therefore they don't kind of stand up and say the prayers and get arrested, but what they do instead is they refuse to officiate a church service at all. They kind of lock the church up, and they don't hold public church services. And this is what William Clark does. He holds services in private houses, which you can kind of get away with, but he doesn't hold a public service. And that means that it's kind of public knowledge then that his church disapproves of the revolution and of independence. You know, you're in Dedham, and the Anglican Church is kind of closed because the minister won't stop praying for George III. And there's another kind of question there of you know, is he kind of just kind of passively stepping back, or is he making an active statement about a sort of active statement of his loyalism? Okay, so at this point he's made a kind of public expression of his politics, and I think probably at this point his days in Massachusetts are numbered. Where he really gets in trouble is when he writes I'm sorry, and I missed something. This is interesting actually, so I do want to read this to you. This is his address to his congregation, explaining his decision to close the church rather than to officiate with this Book of Common Prayer that you're not allowed to use anymore. So he tells his people, you all know that in my preaching I have generally avoided these matters, meaning these political questions. But by vows, oaths, and subscriptions, which have been made on earth and recorded in heaven, I'm obliged to act as a dutiful subject of His Most Gracious Majesty King George III, and to the constant use of the liturgy of that church, of which, under God, he is the head. To give up these prayers and petitions is against the present light of my own conscience. He hopes that by doing so, this conduct will conduce much to our honor and be a means of promoting the revival and permanent stability of our church. And then he concludes by quoting the Book of Revelation. I don't have the chapter and verse here, but it's from the Book of Revelation, it's from the Bible. I conclude what I have to say with these words to our Saviour, to St. John in the Book of Revelations, directed to the church at Smyrna. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, yet you may be tried, and you may have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. So what he's doing here is he's kind of presenting himself as a martyr, a kind of a loyalist martyr, like the early Christian martyrs, being punished by the state, being thrown in prison, but kind of staying true to his conscience, and therefore ultimately being rewarded with a kind of the crown of life, the martyr's crown of eternal life. And this is an idea that I want to come back to. Back to what happens. He gets in a lot of trouble in 1778 when there's a member of his congregation who according to Clarke, utters some loyalist words, loyalist phrase. He says that the present war was a rebellion and that he wants the king's government to be restored. This man is therefore sort of hounded out of town by the people in the town. And William Clarke writes him a letter of introduction to take with him to wherever he ends up. And this is what gets Clarke in trouble. He gets then kind of taken into before the Committee of Safety, which is the kind of local Patriots notables, and he's banished for writing this letter. And first they imprison him on a boat in Boston Harbor. He spends 10 weeks there, and on the boat his kind of health starts to deteriorate, and he has what he calls an asthmatic condition. And as a result of this, he actually loses his voice, which as far as I can tell, for the rest of his life. In light of his deteriorating health, they agree to release him to house arrest, but that's kind of financially untenable because he can't work, he doesn't have an income, and he's also now kind of persona non grata in his local community. So he sort of receives permission to emigrate, which he does kind of via Rhode Island and then to London. At this point, I'm going to kind of just skip through this fairly quickly, just for reasons of time. But the short version is that reading his journal, he spends a number of years in London. I think it's 8 years, and his journal for these years is kind of really depressing reading. And he's really a sort of refugee. He's dependent on charity. He complains about poverty. It's hard to kind of assess that objectively, but he does write about like not being able to afford firewood and this sort of thing in the winter. And there's also this sort of like psychological experience of just being lonely and kind of isolated, and you know, far from home. He leaves his wife in Massachusetts, which is a common thing for these refugees to do, for a kind of family to split up in that way. So just for example, one kind of journal entry, June 28, 1779, the whole entry is just all silence. And you know, he doesn't speak to anyone or do anything all day. He just kind of spends his time tramping around London. At the end of the war, he sort of receives what for him is the awful news that the colonies will be independent, that he, like many loyalists, assumes that American victory will mean the Americans staying in the empire and kind of getting what they wanted to begin with, but instead he discovers that his what he thought was his native country, Massachusetts, is now part of this other country. He can't go back there. They won't let him back, and the British government won't let him back either because they're paying him a loyalist pension. So he goes to Nova Scotia instead. He spends kind of 5 years in Nova Scotia and is kind of pretty miserable there, and then eventually kind of comes back to again, my native country, Massachusetts, in 1792. And he lives for another 25 years, although he's sort of, at this point, kind of aging. He can't officiate as a minister because he can't talk. And so he's kind of, he comes back, but he's not very kind of threatening to anyone. He's in almost a kind of internal exile. And he sort of stays in Massachusetts, dies in 1815. So that's his life. And again, just kind of skipping, this is the a bit of stuff that I skipped over. So I want to conclude by turning back to this idea that I floated earlier, that Clarke presents himself as a kind of loyalist martyr, and there's a kind of question of whether he's picking a fight with the Patriots or kind of parading himself as a victim in order to score points against them. And I think it's possible to kind of read him both ways, but I think it's also interesting that the kind of suffering, when you read his journal, then suffering is the kind of key theme in this journal. All through the sort of journal, he doesn't tell us, as I say, much about what we want to know, but it makes sense if we read it as a kind of spiritual exercise. So for example, he kind of ends every year with this sort of exercise at the end of the year where he tallies up his blessings and his trials, and mostly it's trials, and it's kind of different things throughout his life. Firstly, it's trying to find a job as a minister when he's deaf, and then it's kind of being part of this like Anglican minority in Massachusetts. Then it's the American Revolution. Then it's kind of refugee, exile, all of that, internal exile. But every year at the end of the year, he kind of writes about how much he suffered during the course of the year. And then he sort of reminds himself of the kind of transience of this world and the transience of suffering, and the fact that all of this suffering and affliction is a kind of a part of this sort of transient world, and not part of the world that is to come, which is really what he has to kind of look forward to. So, for example, this is his kind of end of year exercise for 1777. He writes, the revolving sun has measured on and completed another year. And I may truly say that though mercies have been intermingled, it has been a year of sorrow and sufferings. The year has been sorrowful to me on account of my imprisonment. This is the year he gets imprisoned on the boat in the harbour. The greatest part of the year for the testimony of a good conscience and maintaining the rights of government and sentiments favourable to the happiness of mankind. But then he goes on, I've got sort of mercies to be thankful for as well. And then he concludes, the providence of God breaks me not, but still raises friends in the room of such a trial and opens their heart to be bountiful to me. May I never be discouraged, whatever happens, but putting my trust in God, not fear the power of wicked men, but be prepared for the worst, and ready to receive the best with suitable affection and endeavour to give God the glory of all his dispensations. So there was a long quotation I realized to have given you, but the point here is that I think it's clear that his experience as a loyalist has this kind of religious meaning to him. It's part of this experience of kind of suffering in the world, part of this sort of experience of affliction, and essentially that it makes him a kind of a better Christian for suffering for his principles. And that's kind of the note that I want to end on. It's a common thing for loyalists to talk about how much they suffer, and part of that is a kind of propaganda that this is a way for loyalists to make themselves appear more kind of virtuous and moral than the Patriots, and it's often in the context of asking people for help and for money, often the British government, and yet here this is a kind of private journal, and so it's clearly this is more than just a way of kind of scoring political points against the Patriots. There's also this kind of religious quality to his loyalism, which is one of the things I'm really sort of interested in the book in general. So I think I have inevitably gone over what I promised you, but I'm going to leave it at that, and I'll get Faye back in to field some questions. So thank you very much for listening.
Great, thanks so much, Peter. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we'll be taking questions from the chat. So if you have any questions, just type it in there and we'll ask from there. We do have a couple questions that came in during the presentation. The first one is, what is current thinking on what percentage of the colonists were loyalists versus patriots versus neutral?
Yeah.
Was it possible to be neutral?
Yes, so historians try to count, and it's kind of a difficult thing to count. And I think if you'll probably get a number of something like kind of 20% loyalists. Different historians say different things. But in a way, it's also a kind of problematic exercise trying to count, because you have so many people who aren't ideologically committed to one or the other. They're just kind of trying to get by. So you have people, for example, who just kind of switch sides according to, the British army are here, I'm a loyalist, and now they've gone, and I'm in trouble again, and now I'll be a patriot. So when I say kind of neutrals, it's kind of people, not so much people who are kind of standing up and saying, I am a neutral, but people who are actually just kind of trying to get by, as we all are, as most of us are, and not to get dragged into a political dispute that they don't necessarily care very much about. So sort of something like 20%, I think, is a number you would get, and and I ought to be able to give you these numbers off the top of my head. I'm afraid I can't. But you also have an awful lot of Americans leaving as refugees and sort of leaving for sort of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and other parts of what we would now call Canada. So I think it's enough that they ought to have a place in the story, and yet they often don't, because they don't really fit in anywhere else either. They're, as I say, they're not British. They're no more British than the Patriot Americans, but they're this sort of dead end in this kind of interesting way. So here's my answer.
We have another question, which is, how did he, meaning William Clark, overcome his deafness, disability to be an Anglican priest?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I don't know this. I'm reading between the lines, but I wonder if it's easier to be an Anglican priest than a Congregationalist priest if you're deaf, because there's more of an emphasis on sort of ritual and you know, using kind of set forms of words rather than praying extemporaneously. So I think it's clear that he has a hard time finding a sort of a pulpit as a Congregationalist priest because of his deafness. Again, he doesn't ever quite say it, but there's someone, I've got a letter, someone else talking about him where he says that's the case. And so I think that might be part of the attraction of conversion is maybe kind of ministering to in a church where you can just sort of perform more of a ritual function and not have to talk so much. And I'm not sure when he says deaf, I'm not sure exactly how deaf that means. But yeah.
Next question is, I would love to hear more about the Anglican Converts. I first found out about the Congregation Anglican movement when I investigated the life of Reverend Mather Biles, a congregation whose son Mather Jr. adopted Anglicanism, became rector of the Old North Church. Both were loyalists, but father stayed in Boston, son went to England, and Jr. was named in the Banishment Act of 1778.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Mather Biles. I don't know who this is, but he's hilarious. He's got the funniest letters, which, but yeah, another great example of a convert. And so there's a lot to say. That there's a question of what motivates you as an individual, and that's a really hard question to answer. As I kind of hinted at, it's possible with Clark and with some of the others that this is just the kind of you know, just a kind of career move. Although he also, I think, ends up in probably a worse financial situation. What they tend to say is that the Church of England is a kind of free from the disputes that inevitably rend other kinds of churches, and what often upsets them is the kind of disruption to the old kind of New England way of religious life, with kind of new religious groups appearing, you know, so-called like enthusiastic strolling preachers, this kind of thing. So Mather Biles, for example, his congregation, when he's a Congregationalist minister, gets disrupted by the Rogerines, who are a kind of new religious group that appear. So there's this kind of process of this kind of old New England religious establishment sort of breaking down a little bit, and perhaps these people kind of turning to the Church of England as perhaps offering a way out of that, although then in practice actually making the problem worse because they're now another group of dissenters. So as I say, there's a question of motivation, but what I find really interesting about them is they become Anglicans, they become part of the Church of England, but they're all born in America, and they go to England for a few weeks or a few months for this ordination trip. They don't actually really know what the Church of England is in England, and I think in a sense they're kind of converting to their own sort of version of it, their own kind of what they want to find there, which is perhaps a much more you know, kind of consensual, you know, unified religious community than the Church of England actually is at the time. So that's one of the things I find interesting about them is kind of often with converts, there's an element of kind of invention and creativity in, you're not just switching into a new religion, but you're kind of making it up a little bit. Not making it up entirely, but taking it in a kind of new direction according to what you want to find. Clearly also there's kind of something going on here that you know, the zeal of the convert, you know, you've been a vegetarian your whole life and your friend becomes a vegetarian and then tells you that you're doing it wrong, that kind of thing. And I think I get a little bit of that with these people, that they're kind of more Catholic than the Pope, more Anglican than the Archbishop of Canterbury, that kind of thing. And then finally, I think they're interesting because I kind of detect like a little bit of Puritanism in their Anglicanism as well, in terms of this kind of this emphasis on affliction and suffering. I kind of wonder if they're getting that from their Puritan background and some other things like that as well. So there's a lot there to talk about, but I could talk for too long, so I'm going to cut myself off. But I think it's very interesting that they're all converts.
We have some more questions. Are you good to do questions for?
Yeah. No, these are great questions too, so thank you.
Oops, sorry, it went away. Was there a difference between how the Anglicans were handled by Patriots in Massachusetts and Connecticut?
No, it's pretty much, these laws that I described, outlawing worship, or actually outlawing the prayers in the Book of Common Prayer, that's the real kind of flashpoint, and those laws get passed everywhere. They're not kind of particularly targeting Massachusetts or Connecticut Anglicans or any other group of Anglicans. I think that they're, I think it's the laws are clearly targeting the Book of Common Prayer. Like I don't think it's the case that the Book of Common Prayer just happens to fall under this kind of general law about treasonous speech. I think that the revolutionaries want to outlaw these particular prayers as a kind of threat to their sovereignty. So, you know, we're trying to create ourselves as like a new independent people, sovereign over ourselves. We can't have a bunch of members of the Church of England running around praying for the king. That's a kind of symbolic threat to our sovereignty. But they would say we're not kind of persecuting anyone. Just change those like 3 words. And there are plenty of kind of Anglican patriots who do that. So there's nothing about Anglicanism that automatically makes you a loyalist. And in you know, George Washington, for example, is an Anglican. So that it's this kind of particular community of Anglicans who kind of tend to become loyalists. In terms of the legal standing from one colony to the next, there are maybe these subtle differences that you could pass out, but it's a pretty similar story throughout kind of New England.
Did any loyalists settle in the north of England? And did a loyalist diasporic culture develop in Britain more widely?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, so they tend to go to London because, I mean, first of all, because that's where the ships are going. They're often carried by British warships. And there's kind of an emigre life that develops in London. There are like certain coffee houses that you can go to where you know you will meet the other kind of loyalist refugees in London. The problem is that London is expensive. And so in Clark's journal, we actually kind of go through this process of moving through cheaper and cheaper lodgings further and further from the centre of London, and then eventually out to kind of Worcestershire, where, as I say, it gets really depressing after that because he's even kind of more isolated there. He doesn't have the kind of network of refugees that he has in London, but he can't afford London. And so you do have them kind of going elsewhere in Britain, and I know of others who kind of go up to the north as well. But London's the kind of the hub, and I get the impression that when they leave London, they're kind of leaving the networks and they're leaving the action. Does an emigre culture develop in London? Oh, sorry, in Britain. They tend actually not to stay in Britain, but to go to do what Clark does and to go back across the Atlantic to British North America, so what we would now call Canada, sometimes to other parts of the empire as well, but especially to the sort of Canadian colonies. And I think that makes sense that if you can kind of reconstruct your old way of life a lot more completely in Nova Scotia than you can in Worcestershire if you're one of these American refugees. So you do get you do get a kind of diasporic culture. You do get these people all through the British Empire. There's actually, if you're interested in this, there's a really good book by Mayor Jasanoff called Liberty's Exiles, which won a big book award, and it's a really good read. It's not a sort of dry academic book. But so you get them everywhere. You get a kind of diasporic network, but it's kind of strongest in British North America. So and thanks. These are all really great questions.
So the next question is, you've talked about the strong connection between the colonial Anglican ministers and the SPG, which is Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, in England.
In foreign parts.
Foreign parts.
That's the funniest bit, you have to say that.
But did those New England or New York ministers have connections and get support from Maryland, where Anglicanism was stronger, I think, in the Canadian provinces?
Yeah. So the SPG sends missionaries to places where the colonial government does not give them money. So it does send at different times missionaries to other parts of the empire as well, but consistently to this New England and Mid-Atlantic region. There's no financial support from other parts of the empire. If you're a Maryland minister, your salary is paid by a kind of it's essentially like a form of state administered taxation. But people in Maryland, in a parish in Maryland, have got no interest in a kind of missionary endeavor helping people out in New York. They kind of want a minister there for them. It's mostly from London, but there's a couple of other interesting things to say about this. One is that the SPG is a kind of a voluntary society. It doesn't get any money from the English government, the British government later either. It's just like a membership organization where you pay membership fees and the money goes towards paying missionaries. So it's the whole thing is a kind of voluntary thing. They're not kind of state supported in any way. And the other interesting thing, I think, is that the SPG doesn't give them very much money. And this is actually something that I need to look into that I kind of haven't really done the work to do, but it kind of tops off money that they receive from local, from their parishioners, they're members of their church. We'll give them, for example, £60 a year, and then they get £20 a year from the SPG, something like that. So it's sometimes presented as kind of funneling this like vast wealth into supporting the Church of England in New England. This is how the Congregationists depict it, and they will say that of the converts, oh, you were just after like the SPG salary, but the SPG salary actually isn't very much, and really they're in the position of being a voluntary religious society, needing to have people kind of voluntarily give them money, and that just kind of changes everything in all kinds of ways. You have you can no longer have, for example, the person who's in your parish and who pays you tithes just because they're in your parish and they go to church like once a month, but they're not. The people who pay have to choose to pay. So there's a kind of a kind of serious, or a kind of limiting the membership to people who are kind of serious enough to pay. So some of the money comes from London, but most of it actually just comes from the local members.
Does anyone else have any other questions? I think that's the last one I see. And I'll give folks a little bit longer if they'd like to type something in. But as we're waiting, okay. Do we have another question? Okay. Could you touch on the larger diaspora and the time frame of Loyalist ministers? I'm curious, for example, about the ratio of ministers who returned to the US within a decade or two of the conflict and their influence on the American Protestant Episcopal Church, as well as Loyalists who doubled down on the empire.
Yeah. That's really, really interesting. So you have, I think in this region I'm looking at, it's about 50-50 among the Loyalists. Do you stay or do you go? Although then there's a number of those who stay and come back, sometimes after a number of years, as William Clark does. But you do have just actually after the revolution a lot of former Loyalists who get on, who despite opposing the creation of the United States, actually kind of find a place for themselves to a degree in American society. This isn't something I've looked at quite so much, but Rebecca Brannan's written a good book about this, where she kind of says this is like a kind of a local experience. It's not. There's not a kind of story at the level of national politics, but there's a kind of local story of like these former Loyalists just having to kind of figure out how to fit into their local communities and having to kind of repair relationships with former neighbors and that kind of thing. But the problem is it's very hard to get at that. For example, William Clark's diaries, there's just no kind of conflict after his return at all that I can glean from his diaries, although he's often not very forthcoming when you want him to be. So there's a kind of story about reintegration. There's a huge kind of influence on the Protestant Episcopal Church. So, for example, the first bishop in the United States is Samuel Sebry, who gets consecrated as Bishop of Connecticut, and he's a big outspoken Loyalist, publishes a bunch of Loyalist pamphlets, and he becomes the sort of the first bishop. And there's a kind of sort of high church theology that tends to go along with this, and a lot of kind of high church Anglican, so now Episcopalians in the northern states who were former Loyalists or who were kind of associated with that tradition. Although they also, the Episcopal Church as a whole kind of patches this over and kind of manages to get together and not to split off into kind of former Loyalists and former Patriots. And it looks at one point like that might happen, and it doesn't. As for the ones who go to Canada, then yeah, I think there's an effort there to kind of, to build a Loyalist Church of England in British North America, and to kind of take this like disastrous experience of the American Revolution and to turn it into an opportunity to kind of start again with this new vision of the British Empire. And I'm not sure it particularly works out for them, but there are kind of maybe some things that they get out of it. So just an example of this is bishops. I mentioned that there are no bishops in the 13 colonies in the colonial period. And this is a big kind of grievance for these Anglicans, is the fact that a bishop is a kind of essential part of their church, and there's no bishop in America. They have to sail to England for ordination. But it's almost like kind of the first thing they do as kind of resettling as refugees in Nova Scotia is to kind of demand and now finally get a bishop from the British government. So you have kind of Sebry, as a former Loyalist, becomes the Bishop of Connecticut, and just right afterwards, another former Loyalist, Charles Inglis, becomes the Bishop of Nova Scotia. So there's a kind of, it's a similar kind of like Loyalist tradition with a little bit of kind of high church theology in there as well, which you then see evolving in slightly different ways in the northern states of the United States and also in Canada. And there are an awful lot of them, because the SPG at this point, after the revolution, stops sending any missionaries to the United States, and so they all go to British North America. So there are a lot more missionaries in Nova Scotia than there ever were in any single state before the revolution. And I think there's a whole kind of generation, and even sort of intergenerational as well. Like all of these refugees, their sons also become ministers, and so I can kind of look at lists of missionaries in Canada in the middle of the 19th century. I kind of recognize all the names. It's all the sons of these refugees. So I think there's a kind of really lasting influence, which is interesting to me. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so we're almost at the end of our time, but I think we can fit one more question and maybe the last one. There's two more questions left in there. So one of the questions is, were there any Anglican loyalists who became prominent abolitionists in the 1780s when it became a mass mobilization movement in Britain?
That's a great question. Yes, I only know of one actually. I don't know prominent, but he's an abolitionist. Is this guy called Robert Boucher Nichols? Often this is kind of Chris. If you know Chris Brown's book, Moral Capital is really good for reading about this. But you have a lot of opponents of the American Revolution who in Britain are the first to kind of advocate for the abolition of slavery, and they kind of say, you Americans talked about liberty, but we're actually going to kind of put this into practice and abolish slavery, and therefore kind of win the propaganda war with America. So you have kind of other. It comes not so much from American loyalists as kind of British opponents of the American colonists, but you do have some. I do know of kind of one loyalist refugee who kind of gets caught up in that. I kind of wish that I had more of them, but I just have the one, unfortunately. So that's a fantastic question. I wish I knew who asked that.
So there's just one more question in the chat, so okay. We can do that one before we end, which is, someone asks, it seems obvious that there weren't any loyalist Congregationalist ministers, but is that true?
Oh no, there were some, and I don't want to give the impression that there are Loyalist Anglicans and Patriot Anglicans, and there are Loyalist Congregationalists and Patriot Congregationalists. Everywhere it's so complicated. It's a civil war. You have kind of families divided. You have people crossing lines. You don't have like a clear division between Anglicans and being loyalists. So you don't have a 100% division into Anglican loyalists and Patriot Congregationists. It's a kind of a tendency rather than a like hard and fast rule. But what I find interesting, so some people kind of look at this and they ask, why is it that like Anglicanism is producing loyalism in this way? And for me, that's actually not really the interesting question. The interesting question for me is more kind of, how does loyalism shape the religious lives of these Anglicans? And so rather than just trying to using religion to explain the political division into patriots and loyalists, and kind of thinking about the relationship the other way, in the other direction as well. So I don't want to give the impression that this was just a kind of a war of religion between Anglicans and dissenters. It's not. I'm sorry, between Anglicans and Congregationalists. These Anglicans say that it is, but they also say that if you're an Anglican and a patriot, then you're not a good Anglican, and that's logical fallacy. So yeah, you do get kind of individuals everywhere on all sides.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Peter, for your presentation and your excellent taking questions. So fascinating. Thank you as well to everyone who came to our talk tonight. Just as a reminder, we have a history program every Thursday evening at 5:30 on various topics. Next week, we'll be exploring the architecture of King's Chapel. August marks the anniversary of the cornerstone of the church, as well as the opening service at the new building in 1754. So we'll be taking a deep dive into that. But yeah, be sure to check us out on social media and check back on our website for more information about upcoming talks. For our previous July series, which is focused on Revolutionary King's Chapel and looking at kind of the intersections of Anglicanism, the American Revolution, and how that all comes into play. We are in the process of making our past presentations available to view on our website, which someone just asked in the chat. So we can send out an email if people are interested on knowing when that is ready, or you can just get in touch with me directly and I can send you the link. But thank you so much again. Yeah, Peter, did you have any final words before we sign off?
It's incredibly strange giving a talk and not really being able to see who I'm talking to. So I don't really know how many of you that there are, or who you are, or how you're receiving this. But I enjoyed the questions, and I really enjoyed being able to talk to you. And so thank you very much. Also, thank you to Faye for the opportunity. So thank you.
Great. Well, have a nice evening, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.